Welcome to episode 24 of The Expert and the Idiot. Today we're here with Roy Blodgett of Wellspring Herpetoculture. How you doing, Roy?
I'm good, man. How's it going?
As good as it can be.
Yeah, you got a hurricane prep. That's
fun. Just the living the Florida lifestyle.
Yeah.
Whereabouts are you? You're in California?
Yeah, I'm in Northern California. A place called Lake County. It's about 2 hours from San Francisco, kind of a little inland, a little north of there.
Right on. So yeah. What got you into reptiles? Where did it all start with you?
It kind of feels like one of those things where it's just like, right out of the egg, I was into reptiles. I don't really remember where it started. The household that I was born into, we had a lot of animals, and my dad actually kept reptiles. This is back, in the early to mid 90s. And he had all kinds of stuff, pretty eclectic collection. And so that was always, just kind of in the background. And I was always super interested in herping, getting out, and even just in the backyard, I was flipping the woodpile trying to catch alligator lizards. This was right in the middle of the city. We still had, alligator lizards and stuff in the backyard. And, so it honestly just felt like it was always there. It's kind of innate in a way.
So what do you keep now?
My collection is pretty eclectic. I've got some kind of areas of specialty though. I'd say one of the main things is the puffing snakes. So I work with Spilotes, sulphureus. I don't keep pilatus at the moment, although I've had them in the past. And then I also keep a couple species from the Phrynonax genus, the neotropical bird snakes. So I've got the Costa Rican species of that, and then I also have the species that occurs in Suriname, Guyana.
Nice.
I've got a pair of Utah mountain king snakes, and a pair of South American hognose snakes, the Xenodon dorbignii, and then I've got a few Northern Pacific rattlesnakes, which is our local rattlesnake species here. And then lastly, I've got a couple lizards that live in with my my Spilotes, actually, that are kind of just invertebrate control, basically, in those habitats, because I keep everything in like big naturalistic displays with isopods and insects and all that stuff. So those are a plica and a Uranoscodon superciliosus. Those are both just kind of weird, South American lizards that are from that same region as the Spilotes, and they do great in there with the snakes. The snakes don't bother them, and it makes for a pretty awesome way to keep them because they get this huge space.
So do you keep everything naturalistic and with springtails and isopods?
Yeah, that's pretty much my go-to. Even honestly, right now, I like these enclosures over here. I guess those are all my nursery setups for raising up babies, and they're all kept the same way too. Live plants. I've sourced all plants and stuff from the same regions that the animals are from. It's just fun for me to kind of research and geek out on stuff like that. So I enjoy kind of the process of finding those plants and setting them up that way. And yeah, I find that like it's just a more like fulfilling style of keeping for me. It's more gratifying, and I see more behavior and kind of interesting stuff out of my animals that way. I've found over the years, and also it like keeps me interested. I think that I've tried simpler keeping styles in the past, and I just it doesn't keep my interest in the same way, because I'm really like driven by behaviors in my animals. That's like kind of the thing that like the rewarding part about keeping for me is seeing them, exhibit natural behaviors and kind of doing similar things that they would do in the wild, so I found that the best way I can achieve that in the captive conditions is to provide as much, habitat complexity as I can. And so I really enjoy, setting everything up naturalistically and It also helps me kind of like, I think, contextualize the animals that I'm keeping, because I kind of think of, animals, and reptiles in particular are a really good example of this because they're so microhabitat dependent, but I kind of think of them as like expressions of the larger ecologies that they occupy. They're kind of one way that land base or that ecological community kind of expresses itself in the world. And so I like to see them in that context as much as possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you mist manually, or do you have like a misting system set up? Like, are you fully into just like trying to make it as natural as possible for the animal?
Yeah, I do have I have a Mist King set up in both of my rooms. I have two herp rooms, a tropical room, and then kind of a temperate room, which has actually kind of become more of like a nursery room at the moment, just because that's where I keep most of the babies. But I have Mist King setups in both rooms, and I do really enjoy the automation aspect, just because like I can leave for work for a couple of days and know that they're still getting misted and still getting adequate water. And it also helps for cycling stuff for, breeding and all of that. A lot of the stuff that I keep is from equatorial regions. And so they're not necessarily queuing as much off of photo period and temperature differences so much as they're queuing off of differences in precipitation and food availability. And so that helps me kind of manipulate those variables and control those variables in a little bit more. But on top of that, I do also hand mist, periodically, and just to make sure everything's getting hydrated, and also to introduce a bit of chaos, and variability, because I think that's like one of the things that becomes lacking with most systems of automation is you don't get as much of that chaos element, which I think is actually really beneficial and actually helps your animals to become more resilient, to change and all of that stuff.
So how do you set up the Mist King? Like, how is it set up right now to mist the terrariums?
You mean like in like terms of like the cycle I set it up on and all that? Yeah. So I vary it. Usually I do like 3-month cycles. So I'll do like 3 months where I'm misting usually 3 times a day. And they're pretty short misting cycles. Like I'll do one that's like a minute long in the morning, one that's a minute long in the evening, like right after lights out. And then sometime in between, I'll do like a shorter cycle, like a 20-second or a 30-second cycle. Or maybe even a couple of those cycles through the day. So maybe 4 cycles. And then I'll follow that with like a 3-month period of like a dry season where I just do that morning and night misting and let it kind of dry out during the day. And I find that works pretty well for all the stuff I keep. A lot of the stuff I keep, they don't really drink so much from water bowls and stuff. I mean, the snakes will, but the lizards and stuff don't necessarily. They're more drinking droplets off of foliage and stuff like that. And so it seems to help with replicating that, making sure those guys stay hydrated. Down the road, I'd also really like to incorporate fogging at some point, especially at night for my stuff, because I've been doing a lot of reading and hearing from a lot of other more experienced keepers, particularly like chameleon keepers, that talk a lot about the benefits of fogging overnight, because, essentially a lot of the hydration these like lizards and stuff are getting is actually just from just their respiration, just breathing wet air, basically is where they get most of their hydration. It's not actually even from drinking droplets and stuff like that. And so I think that would probably be of huge benefit to a lot of the species I keep here, because they come from regions, where you're going to have like a lot of mist and fog at night. And so that's like kind of one of those things that's like, in the plans for down the road, but I haven't jumped towards that yet, largely just because it's like, it's making another system, it's like, I feel like so much of herpetoculture is like layering these systems progressively, like you start with just like your boxes, like, you got behind you've got your system clearly set up for your habitats. Right. And then it's like, then you add in your lighting systems and your heating systems and your misting systems. And now it's like, okay, I'm going to add a fogging system at some point, but I have to learn how to do that, especially to fog multiple enclosures at once, which probably means making my own DIY fogger. And then the other thing about the fogger that I'm interested is like how to keep it clean, so you're not like growing bacteria and stuff in your PVC pipes, in between fogging sessions, because wet, warm environments are a breeding ground for that kind of stuff. So I gotta do my research about how to do that well. But that's kind of down the road.
Where you're at, I'm assuming that you have that you're in a pretty arid area. Like the humidity is probably pretty low. So like the misting that you're doing, I probably couldn't pull off being in Florida, because I would probably just be sopping wet. You
would be flooding. Yeah, totally. It's totally different. And that's like one of the things I love about herpetoculture too, is it's so dependent on where you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a really cool way to like, learn about things, and it's one of the things about herpetoculture where it's like, I'm always talking about how, like in our own podcast, I co-host a podcast called Project Herpetoculture. And one thing I'm talking about a lot is that I don't like the care sheet model of herpetoculture and all that stuff, because it's like, it doesn't take into account all these other variables about like, if you're in Florida and I'm in, Central California, there's a huge difference in terms of our baseline variables, and that's going to have a huge influence on the way we set things up. Right. And so, where I am, like in the summer here, it is basically, we don't get any precipitation at all from like usually May to the end of October, beginning of November is pretty typical. There's none. And by like right now it's dry and dry. And like, we're getting wildfires all the times right now, because it's just so hot and so dry. And it's regularly, above 100 degrees where I live in the summer. So all of that has a huge impact on the stuff I keep. And a lot of stuff I'm doing in terms of like my climate control in my rooms, I have a mini split set up in each of my rooms. And a lot of that is just actually to keep things cool enough, because it gets so hot here that it's actually too hot for my animals a lot of the time.
What do you keep the temperature at in your rooms?
Usually I aim for like mid 70s in my rooms. That's like the way I think about my mini split basically is it's controlling like my bottom temperatures, like my ambience basically. So what I want like the cool side of the enclosures to be essentially is what I set the mini splits at. And so usually that's like 74 in my tropical room, and then like 68 to 70 in my temperate room, my cold room. And that's just to kind of keep the temperatures. It doesn't perfectly keep them at that right in the enclosures, because the enclosures have these added heating and lighting. So it's a little bit warmer in the setups, but that's what I'm aiming for, is to give, and to help maintain those gradients in the enclosures. And so all the enclosures I use like halogens for heating and, to create like a nice hot basking spot. But in almost all of my setups, there's a gradient from like at least 30 degrees, from like under that halogen, it's going to be usually over 100 degrees, like surface temperatures. And then, by the other end of the setup, it'll probably be in like the low 70s most of the time.
So how do you get that gradient? How large are the enclosures to be able to give them that room to escape?
So a lot of it is the size of the enclosures. I use big setups for the most part. Like the Spilotes enclosure I talk about is huge. It's like 8 feet by 3 feet by 6 feet tall. So it's like a closet basically, size setup. But the awesome thing about that is it allows so much space for those gradients. So I have 3 separate basking areas on that enclosure, like each with their own double halogen. And so that allows the snakes to actually bask independently of one another if they want to. So they don't have to be kind of competing for a basking spot basically. And then like most of the actual gradient is actually vertical. So like at the top of the enclosure, it's nice and warm. And like if they want to get down to cooler temperatures, they can like move down in the branches and get lower in the enclosure, and it's a lot cooler. And then in my smaller setups, like these little condo setups next to me that the babies are in, these are pretty small, but I'm still able to achieve a really wide gradient just by using like a small halogen, like a nano halogen bulb. And usually it's just like a 20-watt nano halogen, pretty tiny little bulb, but it still gets like nice and hot right under the light. But then by the time you get down to the bottom of the enclosure, especially with all the foliage and stuff that creates so much shade and like thermal complexity, basically, it'll still be like a 20 to 30 degree difference from that under that halogen to the bottom of the enclosure. So it's a lot of it is how I set things up, but definitely the size of the enclosures helps to achieve the gradient too.
Nice. I'm actually, I'm having some cages built right now. They're 4x2 by 2.5 tall for
Nice.
for jungle carpets. And cool. I was kind of thinking the same thing, like try to focus more on giving the gradient based on the height that they're at. And then I'm giving them just more volume in their cage too. If I do branches all along the back wall, and then on the one side they can go to a spot that, I might have it where it peaks out at 95 degrees during the day, but then below that on like a piece of slate, it might be 88. And then under that, it might be 84. And then on the other side, it might be, 76, 78 degrees.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
that's kind of, you see it a lot in the hobby where when people say you need X, it needs to be 4 feet. So that way you get the temperature gradient, right? So you're only thinking then going across, never up and down,
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's super, underutilized is that like vertical gradient, and it's totally doable, even in smaller setups. Like I said, if you have like that complexity, whether you're using foliage, if it's fake or real, or like shelves, that kind of thing, anything that'll basically create a barrier from the heat, for the heat to actually penetrate lower in the enclosure, you're making opportunities for more gradients. Right. And I think that's like a huge, growth area in herpetoculture for the majority of keepers, is just how to better utilize the space that they have in their setups. Because a lot of times setups are, I think that people don't fully utilize the volume of the enclosure that they have. They think about like, okay, this is the enclosure size, right? It's a 4x2x2, or it's a 3x2 or whatever. But making the most of whatever that volume is that you've got is something that a lot of people struggle with. And, a lot of it has to do with just creating branches and stuff like that, basically giving your animals access to that full volume as much as possible. And then they'll use it, they'll take care of themselves. Right. It's like, I think that's a lot of the kind of the model of herpetoculture that I like to kind of preach, so to speak, is how do you set it up so that you can be as hands off as possible, and the animal just take care of itself. Cause like it knows what it needs. Right. And it's going to do what it's got to do to take care of itself. And in a lot of ways, it's like about creating opportunities to let them do that, and then just getting out of the way, and then they'll do what they want to do. And so that's kind of what I try to achieve. And I'm always retooling things and learning more and trying to do better. And I have like a pretty like a kind of like a beginner's mindset a lot of the time, because I just feel like herpetoculture in a lot of ways is still pretty young. It's still like it's been around for 50 years or more than that at this point, but in its modern iteration, it's really only been around since like the 90s. That's kind of when herpetoculture really kind of shifted into this, what I think of as like the modern era. And there's still a lot left to learn and to do, I think, in especially like behaviorally and everything with reptiles. So there's all kinds of cool studies coming out about social behavior in reptiles, and all this stuff that 50 years ago would have been like just thrown aside as BS is like now like accepted. And I think that's a really cool thing about it.
Yeah, I was just talking to Owen McIntyre about he was talking about trying to get males to breed, and what he said one way he does that is by taking another python's shed skin from a male and throwing it in there. And he said that male that's paired up with the female will just stick his head into that shed skin.
Oh yeah, and
smell it for like 2 hours.
Oh yeah.
Just, so it really makes you wonder like what kind of data he's trying to get out of that. And, if he's trying to figure out if it's a threat or, it's
totally.
Yeah. It's fascinating. and there's really not a lot of there's not a ton of studies, in a lot of this stuff. I was talking to Dr. Warren Booth about sperm storage in pit vipers, and I had so many questions for him, and he's like, we don't know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's so much that's mysterious about it still, which is, it can be agonizing, right? When we want the answers, but at the same time, it makes it fun. It's like, okay, there's still a lot here. And it creates like a lower barrier to actually contribute something of value in a way, which is cool. It's cool to be in a field where you can contribute something of value by just keeping snakes in boxes at your house. That's a pretty cool opportunity to be part of that.
Yeah, it really makes me wish that there was more actual scientific studies being done on so many of these questions, and it's like, if I'm thinking it, there's got to be smarter people that are thinking it, and we need scientific methods put towards this,
Totally. Yeah.
So many, and like, and it's funny too. You said how you're always changing and everything, and every enclosure I do, I feel like I do it better than the last one, because initially it was like, well, use the grapevine because the grapevine is for some reason superior than what's outside because it's super expensive and I can only get it at reptile shops, and then, well, now I need to, use stainless steel lag screws and put it to the side because if it comes in contact with a moist substrate, it's going to mold. And then I need to install fans and to make sure that I don't mold up again and maybe reduce my misting. And I'm always learning. And now I'm just going out. I have this enormous oak tree. It would probably take 3 people to touch hands around it. And so I had to trim it. And I took these logs like that big and I'm cutting them into small sections. And I'm going to lag screw those to the new enclosures and then have sort of stringer branches going between them. Yeah. Because that grapevine that I kind of put up on a pedestal, it molds really easily. Totally. I found it was full of the post hole beetles. So I had to remove everything, all the substrate, clean all my enclosures. It was a nightmare, and that was just from it sitting in storage, so totally. It's like, I'll go harvest it myself and then cook my oak for 6 or 8 hours or 12 hours, whatever, at 160
whatever you got to do. Yeah.
So it's it's kind of depressing because it's like, man, what am I going to figure out I did wrong with the next setup,
Yeah, dude, I know. It's like, especially when we're investing so much money and everything into it, and then it's like you've done it and 2 years later you're like, oh, I got to redo all this, like it's just not what I want anymore. And I love a lot of my setups that I have right now and I'm super grateful for them. And I've had to work really hard to save up the money to buy a lot of the stuff that I have and all that. And at the same time, I'm also like, man, I can't wait to the point where I have enough time to build my own setups, which is what I want to do, is like actually build my own setups that have like, drains and like plumbing basically in them. So I can just really miss the heck out of them when I want to and not have to worry about flooding them and just all kinds of stuff like that just isn't practical to do on a commercial scale. So the enclosure builders don't do that. But if I'm doing it at home, I can also build the enclosures to the actual room. Cause like one thing I think about, for example, it's like if you're building, if you're setting up your room with a bunch of 4x2x2s and you come to a corner, you lose all that you got a void space in your corner, right behind you there. You got a void.
That's my green void.
Your green void. It's like, damn, if you're building it yourself, you can use that space. You can add another 2 square feet or whatever, or 4 square feet to your enclosure by using that. And so that's like the next frontier for me down the road is actually building my own setup so I can really maximize the usable space for all the animals and maximize the space in the room.
I've thought that so many times. At first I hated it, but now it's a nice green void. So, it has its purpose,
It's working for the podcast. It's a nice backdrop for sure.
It's otherwise a very annoying spot to try to vacuum outside of that.
Dude, I know. Seriously, the way I've got my tropical room set up, I can't even really get into those voids very well.
Yeah.
And I look through the crack and there's just like cobwebs and stuff like that. I got to get back there somehow and clean that up, but it's just such a pain in the ass. So,
and when I put these right here are 6x2x2s, and when I put them here to leave sort of that gap, I didn't make the gap big enough to fit my Dyson vacuum in there, so I have to go from the top and bring it down.
That's how I'm gonna have to do it in my room. Yep, I'm gonna have to climb up on a stool and get down in there.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So what's it like keeping rattlesnakes, and what's the legality of that in California?
Yeah, so in California, it's okay to keep native rattlesnake species except for one, which is the red diamond rattlesnake, Crotalus ruber. Those guys are protected. But all the other rattlesnake species in California, if you have the hunting license or a fishing license, you can actually collect rattlesnakes as long as you're not selling them. You can't commercially sell them. You're not supposed to be breeding them or anything like that. And I actually keep these because one of the things I do is a side hustle, basically, is I do rattlesnake mitigation work. And mostly focused on education. So where I live, there's a lot of people that have, moved out of the cities basically in the Bay Area down south. And, they've bought their little farmhouse in the countryside, and then they go move in and they find out they've got rattlesnakes in their backyard and they don't really know what to do about it. And so I come out and I kind of offer some education about okay, well, this is what the rattlesnakes are doing. This is what they want. These are the things you can do to disincentivize them being close to your home, which usually looks like, have some sort of rodent mitigation in place, be aware of your water sources. Cause like I said, we live in this really dry climate half the year, and they will absolutely utilize surface water and stuff like that if you leave it out for them. And so anyway, all of that said, occasionally I'll have someone call me and say, I've got a rattlesnake that's injured here. Someone tried to kill it. Or a really common one is rattlesnakes that get tangled up in that monofilament plastic bird netting that people put over their vegetable gardens and stuff like that. That stuff is the worst invention of all time when it comes to snakes, because it's flexible enough that they think they can kind of push through it, right, and keep going. But then it's also has enough tensile strength that at a certain point it just stops flexing, and then they can't back out of it because it basically hooks underneath their scales, and usually they end up dying because they get stuck, and then they're out in the sun and the exposure and all that stuff kills them, right? So, but occasionally I'll get calls about a rattlesnake tangled up in bird netting, and so I'll go and tube them and slowly untangle them, and then I'll kind of rehab them for a while and see if there's
what is tubing?
But, tubing is using it's a handling technique for venomous snakes where you basically use a clear, usually it's a clear acrylic tube. You can place that over the snake, and then you can basically hold the snake and the tube simultaneously to prevent them from backing out of the tube, and it allows you to work freely, basically holding them closely when they're not able to bite because their head is inside this tube, right? And usually I'm really hands off with rattlesnakes at this point. I don't free handle them or anything like that. I use tools, but in some cases, I need to be able to work really closely if they're all tangled up in this netting and it's cutting into their flesh and stuff, which is gnarly. I have to get in there with scissors and free them, and the only way to do that safely is if I tube them.
Is that a two-person job, or is that usually just you by yourself?
Usually it's me by myself, but occasionally I'll ask somebody for help. I don't have a lot of herper friends super close by, but thankfully my partner Catherine is pretty game, and she's down to help with stuff like that sometimes if I need it.
Nice.
So the rattlesnakes I have right now, I have 3, and 2 of the 3 are rehab snakes that were just really mangled up in bird netting. And one of them is actually, it's a beautiful, like kind of greenish phase Northern Pacific rattlesnake that she was actually tangled up in bird netting for 3 days. And on this creek bank, at least 3 days. That was how long it took for the property owner to find somebody who would come out and help out the snake. And ultimately she got a hold of me. So I drove out, it's a couple hours away, and disentangled this snake, and she's recovered pretty well. She's still recovering, and she's lost like a whole patch of scales and stuff on her back. And but is otherwise a really beautiful snake and eats well and is thriving. So now she's kind of an ambassador animal here, because I think that she was tangled enough that I think she might have had some like some musculoskeletal damage, as well as like just superficial scale damage. She doesn't move as well as she should. And so, so she's become a pet, an ambassador snake here. And yeah, I really like rattlesnakes a lot. They're actually some of my favorite animals. I mean, that's part of why I got involved in the rattlesnake mitigation work that I do, is just because I really love rattlesnakes. And, you know, of course, like anywhere where there are rattlesnakes, the main thing is people just kill them. Right. And so I try to do what I can to help them out, and keeping them. They're really interesting snakes to keep, because they're really inquisitive. I find they're pretty curious. They like to kind of watch what I'm doing when I'm in the room. And they're also like really visible most of the time. They don't really hide much of the time. A lot of the time they're just like out basking, you know, in a coil, in the classic rattlesnake posture, you know, coiled up. And it's also cool to feed them, you know, and like a lot of times I'll use, you know, long tongs, and I'll get them to like bite this frozen thawed prey item, and then I'll kind of like move it around and put it somewhere else in the enclosure to kind of make them go track it as they would with a wild prey item. It's cool to watch them do stuff like that.
Do they get do they calm down as they're, you know, in captivity longer, or like, are they pretty feisty when you get them and then they kind of get habituated to your movement and presence?
Yeah, it's a good question. It definitely depends on the snake. They're all individuals for sure, but and some are a lot feistier than others. I've had some over the years that were just really defensive. But the 3 that I have now are really mellow. Like they rarely rattle, you know, and they don't seem to really care if I'm in the room and stuff like that. But there are definitely some that started out really defensive, and like every time I walked into the snake room, they would rattle and stuff like that. And usually over time, they kind of start to get habituated to me to some extent and stop doing that and chill out. But like I said, I'm pretty hands off with them. You know, I mostly they're kind of display animals. You know, I'm obviously not holding them and stuff like that. Yeah. So I'm sure that if I got in there with the hook and everything, actually, you know, hooking them out, because I hook them out when I'm doing maintenance and put them in a bucket, you know, while I'm doing that stuff. And they can
you walk me through that? Like what's the process of hooking them out of the cage?
Yeah.
Like how do you do that?
Yeah. So I use mostly 5-gallon buckets with like a screw top lid. That's like when I'm responding to calls and stuff like that, I'll have those. And I also do a double containment system. So I actually have a bag in the bucket. So the snakes go into the bag. I actually pull the bag out of the bucket, or like enough of the bag out so that I can tie a knot, you know, but I'll take the knot that out, and then I'll put the screw top lid on, tie the knot, take the lid off, put the knot into the bucket essentially. So they're like fully contained. And that's like a protocol I do largely because if I'm like driving anywhere with rattlesnakes, and I get in a car wreck and like the bucket gets broken, they're still contained, right? You know, so if there's like emergency responders or whatever, they're not like, oh fuck, there's rattlesnakes in this car, you know, that kind of thing. And so that's a protocol that I learned from Save the Snakes, which is a local nonprofit here. It's not necessarily local. It's a couple hours away from me, but it's in California, and they're focused on human snake conflict mitigation. And they've been authorized by the Rattlesnake Conservancy to teach this protocol, this handling protocol. So anyway, I'll hook the snakes out, get them into the bucket.
What does that look like
contained.
when you're hooking them? Like, where do you go with the hook, and then where is your hand going?
Yeah. Okay. So I would open the door of the enclosure with my tools. So I'll take out the lock, and then I'll open the door with my hook, and then just with one hook, just one hand usually, I'll just reach in. I'll try and hook the snake somewhere around usually mid body or in the first third of the snake. So if they start to move, I'll still be able to lift them kind of, and I'll have them around the middle of their body. And then I'll already have the bucket next to the enclosure with the lid off, and I'll, put the snake into the bucket, and then I have a pair of tongs, like snake tongs, not like feeding tongs. And I'll use those to actually put the bucket lid on, just so that my hands are never actually contacting the snake. And I'm never actually even I'm not gonna take off the bucket lid with just my hands. It's pretty safe to do that, and a lot of people would just do that for the most part. But like anytime you're that close, you're a potential risk. And so I just, because of the frequency with which I interact with rattlesnakes, I have really tried to have like pretty firm protocols so that I don't get complacent and eventually just get tagged because I'm, just a little bit too close because I got relaxed basically. And it's just because it's very expensive to get bitten by a rattlesnake, and I don't really want to. I'm actually curious about I would be curious about the physiological effects of venom and all that stuff. Like there's a part of me that has this like morbid curiosity about like, what would it be like to actually be bitten?
Yeah. But
I don't really want to have to pay for it.
Yeah.
And obviously I'm still going to try to avoid being bitten anyway, but
what is that? What's the contingency if you do get bitten? I'm sure you have a process in place for that, right?
Yeah, I do. So for where I am, it's actually pretty simple because none of the venomous stuff I have, the only stuff I have is just those native rattlesnakes, and it's the species local to here too. It's simple because the local hospitals stock that antivenom. So there are two major antivenoms used for all North American pit vipers. You've got Antivenom and Crofab. Both are FDA approved, high quality antivenoms, and most hospitals carry one or both of those. And so if I was to take a bite, basically the first thing I would do is make sure the snake is contained wherever it is. So if it's if I got bitten on the way to the bucket, I'm going to make sure it gets into the bucket and is secured. And then I'm calling 911, letting them know I got bit, and I'm on my way to the hospital. And I'm also going to call poison control because poison control actually regulates the distribution of antivenom. And so they would be able to coordinate with the hospital and check in with the hospital that I'm going to and make sure that they have sufficient stock. And if not, they could either call me and reroute me to a different hospital or route antivenom to that hospital to make sure they have it. And then, just get there as soon as possible and get antivenom. There's nothing that, to do really in terms of trying to suck out the venom or use those venom extractor things. None of that stuff is good protocol at this point. It's basically just getting to the hospital in a timely fashion. And a big part of this too is I don't work with the rattlesnakes at all unless someone else is home. Someone else is on the property. And so that way, if I do take a bite, I can be like, okay, you got to drive me to the hospital, and it's because ideally you don't want to be driving yourself because some venoms do have strange effects where they might have, some neurotoxic components in the venoms. And that's actually pretty common in rattlesnakes. More and more so, they're finding that more and more in bites that you wouldn't necessarily expect it. You might have some components of the venom that would actually impact muscular function. And also people just go into shock and stuff like that when they get bitten by snakes because it's a really stressful experience. And so Yeah, that's kind of the protocol roughly, is basically just like make sure the snake is contained, get to the hospital. And
So I'm assuming
pretty
you would want to
important.
keep yourself pretty calm then, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, because if your heart rate increases, I'm assuming the venom would spread faster, right?
Yeah, you definitely want to stay as calm as possible. You definitely do. Heart rate, an increased heart rate will aid the spread of venom. Venom's interesting in that it doesn't pass through the bloodstream so much as it passes actually through the lymph system.
Wow.
Which I didn't know that until a few years ago. I was learning more about all this stuff, and I was like, oh wow, it's actually more through the lymphatic system, which is so it's a little bit slower than it would be if it was straight through your bloodstream, unless like there's a 1 in a million chance the snake bit right into an artery or something like that, in which case it would be very bad because you're going to have venom going straight to major things that you don't want it to go to. But I don't know of any cases where I've personally heard of where that's happened, but yeah, the main thing is like there's kind of actually a saying within the venomous community that time is tissue.
It just sounds gross.
Yeah, it sounds gross because it is because especially if you're getting bitten by a North American pit viper, most of these guys have basically it's blood and tissue destroying venom. Those are the primary components in most venoms of North American pit vipers, and so you're going to have localized necrosis and stuff like that, especially if you don't get antivenom quickly. If you get to the hospital and you get antivenom quickly, it's very likely that you're not going to have any lingering effects from a bite, unless it was a really extremely bad bite. Most of the time, you're going to recover fully, but it's time dependent. If it takes you 6 hours to get to the point where you're being administered antivenom, you're going to have a lot more issues than if you got there within an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all about just timing on that stuff.
So when you call 911, is that to let the hospital know to start getting ready, or is that to get an ambulance out, or are you planning on the person that you're paired up with to take you to the hospital and they're just ready for you when you get on site?
It's either or. So definitely to let them know that I'm headed to the hospital and that they're ready for me. That they know I'm coming basically, but also in the case that like I can't drive myself, or there isn't someone here, say I'm on like a call or something like that, I'm not working with snakes at home. Then I would want an ambulance to get there as soon as possible, and be driven in that way. So, yeah, it's kind of a both and yeah, I mean, like you said earlier about the whole staying calm thing, that's an important part of it. The other thing that you can do is you kind of want to have your whatever bitten extremity you have, say you're bitten on the hand or you're bitten on the foot, which is usually what happens is someone gets bitten on the hand or the foot. You want to try and keep that at like a neutral position to your heart, neutral or slightly elevated.
What about like a tourniquet?
You don't want to do that. That can actually make things worse because it can actually localize the venom effects essentially, which especially for tissue destroying venoms and stuff like that, you don't want to do that. For some,
so if it's spreading through your body, it kind of like dilutes the potency.
Exactly.
Sort of. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. It can kind of dilute it to some extent. Although for certain elapids, a compression bandage can be recommended sometimes. It depends on the context, the species, all that stuff. And that's kind of out of the realm of my world, because I don't work with elapids at all here.
Elapids are cobras for those who don't know, correct?
Yeah, it's that whole family. So coral snakes, cobras, mambas, taipans, mostly old world species. Obviously in the new world, we got coral snakes. Those are our elapids in the new world.
The coral snakes are rear fang, right?
No, coral snakes are front fanged.
Son of a bitch. Yeah, we have those in Florida.
Yeah, you do. But the thing about them is that they're so secretive. I think it's really rare that people actually get coral snake bites because they are so secretive. And usually when it happens, it's because of a misidentification, and like a kid or something picked one up thinking it was a milk snake or something like that.
Yeah, scarlet or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I'm asking all these questions because I have two boys that are, they're primitive children. They're always out, they're out and about.
As kids should be.
Yeah, and we don't have a ton of houses in our area, and I'm constantly seeing diamondbacks dead on the road, and
Oh, wow.
people aim for them.
Yeah.
I think, if they see them, they swerve into them and kill them.
Yeah. That sucks.
Our male woman, though, came up to us. She came up our driveway the other day and she said, I don't have anything for you guys, but I always see your boys out, and I wanted to show you the snake that I saw. And it was a diamondback just down the street. And our
Wow,
neighbor ran one over in his truck on purpose. And I told him, please don't do that. They're important to have around. And then I saw a monster. He must have been like over 3 foot. He was over 3 foot,
Nice.
very thick around, that got hit. I've never seen one alive. And the one that my neighbor hit, he didn't kill it. So I had to dispatch that and then bury it.
It's a bummer.
Yeah, huge bummer. I think I measured that. It was either 38 or 42 inches.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
it was
nice.
Yeah, the ones we have around here are huge. So I'm always thinking about my kids, and and I'm glad I asked about the tourniquet, because in your mind it kind of makes sense, especially with a kid and their small body and all that. These kids are only 50 to 100 pounds less than that.
Yeah.
So is it a lot worse when a child gets bitten?
Yeah, unfortunately, I wish I could say it wasn't, but it definitely is worse because the biggest factor, in a bite is, the two biggest factors I should say are, one is the toxicity of the venom, right? Of course. So not all venoms are created equal, and some are way more toxic than others. And even within a single species, different populations within a species can have totally different venom effects and more toxic venoms than others. Because it's, venom is constantly evolving. It's an adaptive, feeding strategy. And so in some areas they need more potent venom to dispatch their prey than in other areas, basically. And, which is kind of the working theory behind why, like the inland taipan, famously is the most venomous land snake. And the reason for that, evolutionarily speaking, is because they live in this area where food is so scarce, it's so arid, it's so dry that when they get an opportunity to get a meal, they basically got to make sure that thing is dead ASAP so that they don't miss that meal. Mm-hmm. And so they just nuke their food. And like the effects of taipan venom on like a rodent is like basically immediate. It's shocking how fast it acts. So rattlesnakes, on the other end of the spectrum, it's a far less significant thing to be bitten, but the beyond the toxicity is the yield, is the actual quantity of venom delivered. And then that has a relationship then to the mass of whatever is being bitten. So like if you're a 250-pound dude and you get, let's say you get a teaspoon of venom, and I'm just totally arbitrary numbers, right?
Sure.
It's going to be a lot less bad than a 50-pound kid receiving a teaspoon of venom.
Sure.
Because there's that mass to volume ratio, basically.
Dose makes the poison.
Exactly. And so it is more significant. And that's also why, like, pets being bitten, like dogs, for example, most dogs will survive a rattlesnake bite, but their mortality rates are way higher than the mortality rates of people. And it's typically because dogs are a lot smaller than people usually. Mm-hmm. And also because typically dogs get bit on the face.
Yep.
Because they're going up to sniff the snake and they get themselves bit, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So all that said, the likelihood of like mortality from a rattlesnake bite, even in children and stuff like that, is extremely, extremely low. So, like statistically in the US, there's usually an average of like 6,000 to 9,000 bites, venomous snake bites per year, mm-hmm. and fewer than 5 fatalities. So it's
That's
really,
good.
it's a really small number of fatalities. Yeah. And
What about
um,
amputation? Is that common?
also rare. Yeah. Really
Okay.
rare.
Okay.
Yeah. Thankfully. And a lot of that too is because of the antivenoms that we have now, like and it's, what's interesting is that Antivip and Crofab, they act differently actually. And so, um, because of the way that they're basically made, one of them, to like put it in layman's terms, basically has is slower acting, so it takes a little bit longer to have an effect and to start to reverse the venom effects, but it has a longer half-life in the body.
Hmm.
And that's Crofab. And then Antivip acts more quickly. It starts to reverse the venom effects pretty much immediately, but it has a shorter half-life in the body.
Okay.
And so you may need more vials essentially of that. And the ideal scenario is they actually get both.
Hmm.
You get a vial of Crofab and a vial of Antivip to start. That's like if I could ask the doctor for my antivenom prescription, that's what I would want.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not all hospitals carry both, but a lot of them do. And so it's interesting how they work. And yeah, like I said, if in the, obviously, God forbid, one of your kiddos, stepped on a diamondback and got bit, like it's basically just, you just got to get to the hospital and they're going to be okay. It's going to suck, for sure. It's going to hurt being bit by a rattlesnake. I've never heard anyone say it wasn't painful. The people I know who've been tagged, I've never been tagged personally, but everyone I've talked to has been like, yeah, it really hurts. But thankfully all of them also have been okay, and they haven't really had, life-changing effects from it ultimately. So
Now I'm still kind of blown away that the coral snakes are elapids. I
yeah,
didn't know that.
yeah.
That's so
Our native
interesting.
elapids. Yeah, we've got those guys, and then there's some of the sea snakes. They're elapids, and some of those guys, are off the coast in the U.S. But I don't really know that anyone really gets bitten by sea snakes very often. But
Yeah, what would you be doing to get bit by a sea snake?
I think you'd have to swim with it and try and grab it while you're swimming with it.
Some Indiana Jones shit right there.
Yeah, exactly. You gotta do that. So it's not super high risk for people, but
About what is the cost of a rattlesnake bite? Do you know? I feel like that's something you would know.
it's in the tens of thousands usually.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, it's really expensive. Thanks to our healthcare system here in the U.S. You can expect to pay a lot for a rattlesnake bite. You go to Mexico and get treatment there, you get the same, basically the same thing in terms of antivenom, same treatment. It'll be a lot less. It'll be in the hundreds, but here in the U.S., you can expect to pay tens of thousands. Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting. One of the people who was involved with actually manufacturing or creating Antivip, because it's a more recent product and it was actually more recently FDA approved. He has an article that he wrote that talks a little bit about why antivenom is so expensive in the US and kind of just all the factors that go into play with that and why it's so much cheaper in other countries. And of course, it's all comes down to the politics and the healthcare systems and all that stuff. So
yeah,
it's definitely a very expensive thing. And sometimes insurance will cover it, but it depends on the insurance you have. And it's definitely something to be avoided regardless. And thankfully it's usually pretty easy to avoid. Although the majority of bites are accidental, there's definitely a percentage of bites that come from people messing with the snake, but the majority are still people, accidentally stepping on a snake, something like that. Because one thing about rattlesnakes that can be a challenge is that their first line of defense is just their camouflage, and they're just going to sit there motionless and hope that whatever is walking by just keeps walking by, and they're not really interested in revealing themselves necessarily by putting on a big show and rattling and all that. And that's kind of their second order of defense, right? Is the rattling and this defensive display. And then, last resort is biting, right? So, and it's important to know, like the biting, the venom, it's not a defensive adaptation. It's for their food. And so they're not actually really wanting to bite us and use their venom on us as a defensive thing. It's kind of a last resort for them. But the problem that can happen is that sometimes they can be in that first order defense of the camouflage, and then someone will just step right on them before the snake. The snake might even be sleeping, who knows? And then it just can bite defensively. But even then, it's interesting. There's actually a study that was done pretty recently where some researchers took a fake human leg.
I had heard about that. I was actually going to ask you.
Stepped on snakes with it, and it was like some tiny percentage of the snakes that actually bit, like as their first reaction to that. It was still a really small percentage. So
it's kind of a dick experiment, but they found some stuff out.
Yeah, they learned some things, and I don't think any snakes were harmed in the experiment, but apart from being irritated for sure. But
how high was that guy to say, let's get a fake leg and go stomp on some snakes?
Yeah, seriously, man. That's pretty funny. It's cool.
But yeah,
it's cool.
I mean, I saw that most of them, their first response was, oh shit, I got to get out of here. Like they just didn't want any part of it.
Yeah. And that's my experience too, working with them. It's actually really rare that a snake even strikes at me. And I see hundreds of rattlesnakes every year at this point. I see a lot.
Yeah.
And I've worked with thousands at this point in my life. And it's a very smaller percentage that are super striky and defensive. And, occasionally I will have one, they'll bite the tongs or they'll bite the hook or something like that, but that's not common.
Now, what's the state rules or laws on what you can do with the snake once you get it? Are there any, or is it just like I go get a snake and you just take it and move it anywhere? Do you have to keep it on the property? Because here in Florida, if you have a venomous snake on your property, you can relocate it, but it still has to be on your property, which is stupid.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of how it goes here too, for the most part. Okay. So there are a bunch of people that do rattlesnake relocation in California, and there are even some people that make a very good living doing it. It's like a big business for some people. And most of them are technically not doing it legally. So if with a fishing license, I could go, answer a call from somebody and collect that snake. And if I'm killing it, it doesn't really matter as long as I have a fishing license.
It's terrible.
However, if I'm doing things commercially and I have a business around this, I'm making money off of it. I can't relocate that snake legally outside the property boundaries unless I have a specific permit. And the permit, there's actually not a permit in place in California specifically for that. There's this other permit that is actually geared for academics and institutions to be able to do research on snakes that you can apply for, but it's a very tedious application process. I'm actually in the application process right now.
Oh, wow.
So I can do this, legally and actually make it into a business essentially at some point, but it's called a scientific collector's permit. And that allows for you to relocate rattlesnakes. That said, I honestly, of course, that's what everyone wants. That's what everyone, if they're calling you about a rattlesnake, most of the time it's because they want you to come get this snake and move it as far the hell away from their house as possible, which is totally understandable, but it's actually something that I try to emphasize as little as possible. And I really try to use that as an opportunity to talk to the homeowner and try and offer them some education, potentially set up a consultation, which is another service that I offer where I'll actually come out to the person's property. I'll basically do an inspection with them, and then I'll follow up with like a report, basically being like, okay, these are the things that you got to be aware of based on where you live, how rattlesnakes might utilize this space, what you can do to mitigate that. Because I think that is actually a lot more effective, because it's like, if I go and I relocate the snake, it's like, I'm never going to relocate every rattlesnake. It's not really a solution, right? It's like an immediate fix, but it's not a long-term one. But there's oftentimes a lot of things that people do that they're not aware that they're doing that is actually incentivizing snakes to be closer to their houses than they would otherwise be. And so I try to help people identify that stuff. But, and then the other reason why I try not to do translocation as much is just that it's hard on the snakes. There's a handful of studies that have been done at this point with translocation, and there's some variability in the results of the studies, but there's pretty much a consensus at this point that it's hard on the snakes, and then the further away that you're moving them, the harder it is. And beyond like a half mile, the mortality increases to like above 80% or something like that for translocated snakes, because they just get disoriented. And then they basically, what they do is they start moving aimlessly, trying to find an orientation point, trying to find something that they recognize. And in that process, they're super vulnerable to predation. They're super vulnerable to exposure. And especially like where I live in the summer here, it's like, a rattlesnake that doesn't have shelter is dead within like 20 minutes from exposure here, because it's so hot that if the snake doesn't know where to go to get cool, get into some deep shade, get into a burrow or underneath a rock or whatever, it'll just get too hot and they'll overheat and die. And they're way more vulnerable to that than people realize, because, we think of ectotherms as like, oh, they love the heat, and everything. And it's like, well, they can't cool themselves down. Like, they can't sweat, or anything like that. The only way they can essentially escape that heat and cool down is to find a refuge of some kind. And so that's why I try to avoid it as much as possible. And when I do it, I try to do it within a half mile, and that way the snake is still kind of within its general home range. And, a lot of people say like, oh, isn't it just going to go straight back to wherever it came from? And I've never actually experienced that so far. I mean, of course it's possible, but I've never had a snake go right back to where I removed it from. And I've actually never moved the same snake twice from the same place. And I know that because I take a photo of every snake that I move in the bucket, and they're pretty easy to identify as individuals because they all have little pattern variations and stuff like that you can kind of pick out and identify them based on.
Right on. What are you looking for when you go out to somebody's house? And is it a koi pond and a chicken coop, so that there's rats eating the chicken feed, and the koi pond is giving a water supply and all that, and it's basically now this oasis for rattlesnakes to come to?
Yeah, totally. It's a lot of times it's stuff like that. So it's like, bird feeders, chicken coops, stuff like that, where, you're creating a lot of rodent feed basically, and that's creating a rodent problem. It's making it so that the path of least resistance for the snakes is to come closer to people than they otherwise would. Sometimes it's water related. It can be as simple as like a leaky hose sometimes, or like outdoor storage units, like mini split condensers and stuff like that. They'll create condensation, and that little drip of water is like a real premium for wildlife sometimes, And so, like I see a lot of rattlesnakes hanging out right next to AC units and stuff like that, for that little bit of residual moisture and stuff like that. Another thing I'm always looking at is like, what's the slope and aspect at the place. If the people are living on like a south facing slope, that can create other variables where you might have potential, dens or hibernacula, that kind of thing. And so sometimes I'll try and see if that's at play. And if it is, I have to be I have to be kind of strategic and sensitive about how I, approach that kind of topic with the homeowner. Cause sometimes people are just like, oh, can you destroy it? Or can we like gas it or, or something like that, all of which is actually not legal. Or, like I would say not ethical, of course. But
so
there are other things that people can do where in that case, like you can create like an exclusion area, basically sometimes like actual snake fencing, basically. So for people who have like a lot of rattlesnakes and there's not really a whole lot you can do about it, sometimes what I'll suggest is actually creating like an exclusion area within their yard where they can at least have some part of their yard, where they don't have to worry about rattlesnakes, and actually create like snake fencing. And that stuff is actually really effective if it's installed properly, which is a big if, because I've gone to a lot of properties where people have like hired someone to do a snake fence who didn't actually know what they were doing. And they actually made it worse because sometimes you can actually create a snake funnel where, if you create a fence, but then you don't, have a solution for like when you get to gates and stuff like that, all it's doing is basically the snake's hitting the snake fence. It's traveling along it until there's an opening and then it goes right in, say at a gate. And then it's in this exclusion area until it can find its way back around to that gate and get back out.
Yeah.
So you can actually trap snakes. And so it's really important to know how to do it. And sometimes I'll consult with people and I'll do it, or I'll do it myself. Sometimes if it's a small project, I'm a one-man operation, so I don't want to be like, trying to do a rattlesnake fence around like 5 acres or something. But if it's like a, backyard area, I'm happy to help with people, and that kind of thing, and make sure that they can get a quality installation that'll actually keep the snakes out. And that can be a great solution in those circumstances where you're just going to have a lot of snakes, but it's honestly rare. I mean, most of the time it's something obvious. It's like there's this one place I went to where, they were like ready to leave, they were ready. Like they had like this multi-million-dollar fancy house on this beautiful mountain basically. And they were like ready to move because they had so many rattlesnakes and they're worried that their grandchildren were going to get bit or something like that. And so I came out to do a consultation with them, and within like 20 minutes of walking the yard with them, I'd already found like 4 rattlesnakes.
Holy cow.
And within like this 3-acre fenced area. And they had actually done a snake fence, although it wasn't done properly. And so I noticed though, like pretty immediately that like this person had like within this 3-acre space, she probably had like 20 or 30 bird feeders. She like really loved wild birds. And there was bird seed everywhere. And there was rodent sign everywhere. And I was like, okay, we got to like have like a 1 bird feeder per acre rule. Like, I was like, I think you're overdoing it with the bird feeders and this is what's happening. And so she changed that. And then, I suggested what they should do to fix their fencing to make it actually effective. And so they did that. And now they're seeing like 1 to 2 rattlesnakes a year, that are finding their way in through, imperfections in the snake fencing that was done basically.
Wow. But
that's like a huge difference from what they had been experiencing, which was like every day they were seeing rattlesnakes pretty much. And, they were having close calls with their dog and with their grandchildren and stuff like that. So, it's cool to actually be able to help, people with stuff like that. And also like a lot of times I'm surprised actually at how effective it can be for people who have never talked to somebody who like actually appreciates rattlesnakes before, to have their like feelings about them changed, because I'm really passionate about them and I think they're really interesting animals. And I like try to appeal to like how they're interesting, and their natural behaviors and their ecology and their social behavior, all that stuff. I'm trying to educate people about that. And pretty quickly, a lot of times people become curious about them and they actually have more regard for them and less fear for them, based on that. And that's been true with that same couple where they like, they were like killing every snake they would see. And now they're like, oh, we'll let them, they can have their area and we can have ours, and we can coexist. And that's like the best when I can have an impact like that, because a lot of the issues with, any kind of like wildlife mitigation, conflict stuff, ultimately, like at the end of the day, you can't help but come up against this thing where you're actually dealing with like what's needed is actually like cultural change at the end of the day, is for like people to have a different orientation to wildlife in the first place. And that's really hard because obviously culture doesn't change overnight. And I've also helped out with like bear mitigation stuff. I'm part of a project here called the North Bay Bear Coalition, where we have more black bears in California right now than we've ever had before. And because of that, they're moving into areas and habitats that they've never been seen in before. And it's creating conflict, right? They're moving into people's backyard and stuff like that. And so,
that would actually be terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds terrifying, but then also once you actually learn a little bit more about black bears and stuff, it's like, they're kind of usually, it's like, it's pretty easy to avoid having a conflict with them for the most part, and they're usually very skittish unless they become really habituated to people, people's food, people's trash. That's when they become a problem.
Yeah.
And so, but like with all these things, again, like it's really about like changing the culture on some level and getting people to consider like, oh, like, yeah, when I moved out to the country, like that's part of what I was actually moving out here for, is to be closer to nature. But that also means being closer to all of nature, which includes like things that can scare you and things that can potentially eat you, and like, I'm kind of one of those weirdos that like thinks that that's actually good for us on some level, to be in the presence of things that are more powerful than ourselves. I think that that's a good thing, for us to keep us in check. And so, obviously I'm not going to like lead with that when I'm trying to like talk to people about, rattlesnakes or bears for the first time. But if I can kind of help people come to that recognition or realization on their own that like, oh, actually there is something, powerful or beneficial for me on some level to living alongside these things, even if it's just reminding me to be more aware. It's like a lot of times I try and help people to just like have more awareness when they're moving around their land in their yard and stuff like that. Just think like, watch where you're putting your hands, watch where you're putting your feet when you're living alongside rattlesnakes. A lot of times that can actually help people to be just more present in their day-to-day lives, which is a good thing because all of us lead these crazy busy lives, and there's constant incentives for us to speed up and do things more sloppily, and to like have less awareness and presence. And so I think that, on some level we can all benefit from having reminders to stay more focused and present with where we are and what we're doing. And,
isn't that funny that there's all these apps for meditation and like being present in the moment and all that, and but so much of our life where it's beneficial for us to not do that, to be moving fast and sloppy and just get on and on to the next thing.
Totally, man. I mean, it's just the times that we're living in, and it's like the demands of the economics that we're living in. It's like I feel it all the time, it's like I'm hustling all the time just to break even or make ends meet here, and like, I'm like definitely looking for a way to make that change so that I can have more security and more of a safety net and I can kind of slow the hell down a little bit. But it seems like despite that being a strong intention of mine, every year it just gets harder and harder to like, make a living and there's that constant need to push, to move faster and work harder. And, and in a lot of ways I'm game to meet that demand. And in other ways I resent it. Cause it's like, I do think that we'd all benefit from slowing the hell down, and that's part of, I think why, I love herpetoculture on some level is that like, it's an opportunity for me to do that. When I'm in the herp room and I'm just like doing maintenance, I'm pruning plants in the enclosures and I'm feeding lizards and feeding snakes and cleaning water bowls. I'm kind of, I'm just present with those tasks, and maybe I've got a podcast on or some music, but there's like kind of like a routine to all of it that is soothing, cause it's just very simple and pretty slow. And also the animals, like if I'm slower and more deliberate with them, they're more relaxed with me. So there's also an incentive for me to be slower and more relaxed and more present. It makes for a better relationship with the animals. And so that there's also encouragement there. And I don't know. It's like, it's on our show, Project Herpetoculture, we're often talking about like, why do we do these things? Why are so many of us, why do we get so obsessed and so sucked into this practice of herpetoculture? Right. And I think that in some ways there's all kinds of like subcognitive reasons why it feels so good, things that we might not even be fully aware of, or that we are fully understanding in a cognitive way, but clearly we're receiving benefit from it. And I think that part of it is stuff like that, is that it helps us slow the hell down in these crazy times that we're living in, and be present with other living creatures, which is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I was just listening to your episode with Lucas Lee, and you guys had a great conversation about, if you weren't in a world where we kept animals in boxes, would you be keeping animals in boxes, or would you be saying, no, that's disturbing,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a good thing to think about, like I think about it a lot. And it's like, I've said it before, but like, it's like in a perfect world, I think it would be irrelevant to keep animals in boxes, like, because there would just be no, like, it would be almost unthinkable because there's no need for it, but that's not the world I'm living in. And so it's like, we have animals in captivity, we have animals in boxes. And there is a degree of, of guilt that I feel about that on some days. And I don't like think that we should be ashamed or guilty for it or whatever, but I do think that we should be aware of the complexity of it, and let that awareness drive us to provide better lives for our animals, right? Which only benefits us. It's like, if your animals are healthier and happier, it's only a good thing for you too. And so I'm always, that's again, part of my motivation, and always striving to learn more and do better as a keeper, is to make sure that I'm staying aware of that reality, and striving to make it a good life for the animals in my care. And I think it is. I think that, like, I definitely think that the animals I have, I don't like witness them showing signs of like suffering and neuroses, and exhibiting behaviors that show a lot of stress and stuff like that. And that's good, because there have been times in the past where I have had animals that were stressed out, and that stressed me the hell out. There's nothing more stressful than like trying to get a snake that doesn't want to eat, this snake that's super stressed out, to like calm the hell down and stop, pacing or, glass surfing or whatever. Like, all that stuff is it's not fun as a keeper to deal with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
and that's like psychotic behavior from the animal. And then you think about it and you're like, man, what if I was being kept in a room, and there was this glass door? I'd probably be pacing in front of that glass door, just thinking, when the hell can I get out of here?
Totally. And I think that, like, the fact that we see both of those things within captivity tells us that there's a way that we can do it right. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That there is a way to avoid those kinds of things. Cause like, you can go to some zoos and you can see the tiger is just pacing all day long. That's all it does. Mm-hmm. And it's like, this is not right, and it's like, you can draw the line in the sand there and say, like, this tiger shouldn't be living like this, and you can go to other zoos where that's not the case. The tiger's relaxed, and it's like, it's exhibiting standard healthy behavior. And so then you can look at like, okay, well, how are they keeping the tigers here versus how are they keeping the tigers there? And it's kind of the same thing with herpetoculture, right? It's like, you can look at what works for certain species and for certain contexts and what doesn't, and just take that to do better.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm dealing with a couple baby Argentine boas right now that have regurgitated, and I think that they're out of that now, fingers crossed, you know, and it's like, you know, it's like, what did it, you know, it makes you just feel terrible all day, all night, just sitting there thinking, what am I doing wrong here? Cause I can't figure it out. You know, is it too much? Are they stressed out, you know? And then you think like the process of just them getting shipped across the country, you know, and one of them was in a Tupperware container in their own waste, you know, and you know, and halfway shed too. So it was like half shed in just urine and feces, and it defecated all over itself. And it was probably it was, you know, maybe 70 degrees, and, you know, so it's just like, you know, you put yourself in that situation, and you think somebody gives you a big bucket of KFC, and what do you think's going to happen after you eat it? You know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, it's real. It's like, it can be helpful to think of things in terms like that, you know, like, oh shit, this animal's actually been through a lot.
Yeah.
You know, if I had been through something comparable, I wouldn't be doing great right now either. And, you know, I think, again, that's another thing I think that's just really good about herpetoculture is it's like it helps us empathize, you know, with things that are not like us. You know, there's a lot of difference between you and that Argentine boa, and the fact that you can feel so strongly about it and empathize so strongly with it. It shows that, you know, you're an intact creature, you know, like your capacity to feel is intact. And that's a good thing, because again, like I said, it's the world that we're living in these days isn't necessarily conducive to that. You know, there's a lot of intense stuff out there that divides us from even other individuals of our own species, you know, and not even to speak of how we orient to other creatures and other species. And so I think it's cool.
Well, and especially with social media and everything, you see these guys that are smacking retics in the head and trying to get a reaction out of them. You know, just so that way people sit there and go, ooh, look, the snake is mean. It's trying to bite the guy. And it's like, how would you feel if somebody kidnapped you and started smacking you in the face?
Yeah.
You know,
totally.
like
I can't even look at that stuff anymore. I just can't stomach it. It's just like,
well, and the free handling too. You had mentioned free handling, and I see that, and it makes me cringe so hard when you see this guy out in the desert that is picking up a rattlesnake and running it through his hands, and just no hook, not you know, you can't even see a hook, and he's just sitting there like, oh, I'm in tune with nature. No, you're not, bitch. You're holding a snake that's really scared right now, and you're stressing that animal out for likes.
Yeah, or even in the best case scenario, like that snake is relaxed or whatever for whatever reason, like that content is likely to be consumed by a kid who doesn't have that awareness of the snake's body language, who doesn't have all of that experience necessarily around snakes, and who thinks like, oh, I can do that. That doesn't look hard, and gets themselves bit. You know, and that's a huge part of like where I draw the line with the free handling stuff, where it's like, I totally like, I respect people's right to do what they want to do with their own bodies and time. And, you know, even if it's stupid, if they want to do stupid shit with themselves, as long as they're not hurting other people, that's on them.
Which potentially they could be, right? Because they're going to tax, if they get bit and they put that tax on the medical system, and that takes away antivenom from people that have been accidentally bit or legitimately bit because they were removing an animal from where it shouldn't be, or it's in danger. Like in your situation, you know, let's say you're cutting one out of some of that bird mesh and it bites you, and you're doing something you have to do. You know, and now, oh, well, guess what? The asshole that wanted to free handle a rattlesnake, he's getting treatment.
Yeah.
And you're
that's
not.
Exactly where that's exactly where I draw the line too, where it's like, it's actually not harmless. To do that kind of shit, you know? And like there was this whole thing that happened recently with this guy who got bit by his pet taipan. it became like this whole social media thing, and people were drawing lines on the sand about like, oh, these people are bad because they're not willing to like give their antivenom to this guy who's a free handler and all this stuff. And it's like, it's just a complete mess. But that guy did everything wrong leading up to that situation. He didn't have the antivenom that he needed for that snake. He was handling the animal inappropriately. He got bit, and then he got bailed out because zoos gave up their stock to keep him alive. But now those zoos are in a place of vulnerability, and getting Australian elapid antivenom is not an easy or inexpensive process. It's going to be months before that antivenom is replaced in the stock of those zoos. And it's a really dangerous thing. If a keeper gets bitten, or something like that, now they're in a whole situation. So,
and where are his animals?
I'm really not. Yeah, they're all dead.
They're all dead.
Yeah, they were all confiscated and euthanized. And
so that's a pretty hefty tax to pay for showing everybody how cool and tough you are.
Totally. And also all those animals were kept in apparently deplorable conditions.
Yeah.
Like horrific conditions, and so it's like, it becomes pretty obvious what that whole thing was about. And it wasn't about the animals.
Yeah.
It wasn't about educating anybody about those animals. It wasn't about regarding those animals with respect and dignity and compassion. And ultimately what it was about was one person's ego and need for attention, and how they were able to then monetize that to their financial benefit. Yeah. Which is like, this is like the gnarly thing, right? About all the free handling and the social media stuff, is that like, it makes for really viral content for people to just go out and free handle rattlesnakes and film it and put it out there. And, it's really easy to do that and make a bunch of money off of it. And I just, again, it's like, okay, well, what's the actual cost, beyond the financials of it? It's like, what if, some kid again gets inspired because they watch some free handler's video and they go out and get tagged? Like that's all I really need to think about to kind of not engage with that kind of behavior. Beyond my own self-preservation instincts, it's also like, it's caring about, the fact that all of us within herpetoculture are ambassadors for herpetoculture. And herpetoculture doesn't have the best PR, and so there's a lot of room for people to be better advocates and better ambassadors for the herpetological community. And it's something that I think about a lot, because it's my life aside from herpetoculture. It's like, I have a whole life aside from it. It's not like everyone in my community is into herpetoculture and stuff like that. Like I'm kind of on a little island as far as that goes, and I have like an online community of herpetoculture folks that I'm close with and all that stuff. But in my day-to-day life, it's pretty separate. And it's a bummer to like talk to people about like, oh yeah, I keep snakes, and like I'm already like working my way out of a trench immediately, because like people's immediate connotation of that is like weirdos in their parents' basements, like, or free handling, or Steve Irwin, who like, I mean, I'm not talking shit about Steve Irwin. I loved Steve Irwin as a kid and all that stuff, but like, in hindsight, there was a lot of things he did that wasn't the best in terms of like PR, and so, that's also part of the way why I keep things the way I do. It's like when I have people come over and they're like, oh, can I see your snakes or whatever? Like, I've never had somebody come in and be like, oh, this looks terrible, or like these animals seem like they're suffering. It's like pretty unanimously people are like, holy shit, this is amazing. And like, I didn't even realize that people did this, kept snakes like this, because they're their only exposure to it is like their next door neighbor who has like a pet corn snake on newspaper in the garage, and not to slander that, but it's a different look and it's a different impact for the outsider to see, the kind of setup you have behind you right now than it is for somebody to walk into a room of, rack systems or, animals that are kept in really bland conditions. It's a really different impact in terms of like how it influences people's perception in the public.
Yeah, I mean, I would never name the zoo, but I've been to zoos where I have a great time until I get to the snake room or the reptile area, and I'm like, oh my God, this is horrendous.
Yeah,
and like you look at it and you pick out 20 things wrong with the enclosure just the second you see it, and the snake looks dried out and dehydrated, and there's a dish with feeders sitting on it and stuff like that, and it drives you up a wall, and there's so many zoos that are doing it right. But like you said, when you show your animals and your enclosures to people, quite often their first reaction is, why would you do that? Why do you have snakes? What do you do with them? And then and then they'll see like a picture of my like my 6x2x2 with just fake palms all along the back of it, so that way my snake can sprawl out and be totally hidden at 6 foot.
Awesome.
and so and then they see that and they go, wow, that looks like a zoo enclosure. Like and I mean that in the best way possible.
Totally.
I take it that way.
Totally.
But it's, that, and just going back to the other guy that I won't even name, who I wasn't familiar with because I'm not interested in HOTS and things like that.
Yeah.
If I could keep some things, that would be incredible. But in Florida, it's like almost impossible. Like
it's a huge process. Yeah,
it's crazy.
1,000 hours per family, right? Something like that.
Yeah, and if I could, I would love to go out and collect like a pygmy rattler or something like that and keep them. That would be incredible. But for him to do that, and then like you said, it incentivizes basically a whole market then for getting likes and getting attention of free handling. And then so you once I looked at his account after the news came out, and I didn't shit post or anything like that. I basically avoided the whole thing. I didn't want any part of any of it. But then since I looked at his account, all of a sudden now in my feed, I'm getting people free handling. Yeah. And I'm seeing these, I mean, one kid had to have been under 20 years old, free handling out in nature. And it's like, for what, 37 likes, bro? Like that's what you have on this reel or short or whatever it was. Yeah. You have 37 likes.
Yeah, I know. I see it all the time. And same thing for me. Like I'd never heard of that guy or anything until what happened. And I had a similar trajectory of like, and then I went and looked at it, and then I was also getting suggested stuff of like, oh God, this is this whole world that I've insulated myself from very intentionally. And now I have to look at it, and it's pretty stressful to see because it's not what you want to see.
The anxiety that I feel when I watch some of his videos. I was so anxious watching it, especially with the Gaboon vipers, which are...
That's the one that was coming to mind for me too, man.
Yeah, and it's like, that's like one of my favorite snakes that I'll never have, right? They're such a cool snake.
Incredible.
So beautiful. And the fact that animal is dead now.
It's sad.
It's sad. It's haunting then watching those videos where that they were in bad conditions and such bad conditions that, no zoos or anybody wanted to take those animals, and they've all been euthanized.
Yeah, I know.
It's terrible.
There's no justice for the animals at all in that. And there's no justice for the good keepers either, because like legislation is going to happen that's gonna make things harder for people who are already doing the responsible things. And that's what really sucks about all this, right? Is that like The only people who really get hurt in the end of the day about all this stuff is it's the people who are already going out of their way to do things right.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idiots are going to keep doing stuff in an idiotic way, and whether or not it's legal, they've already, like you said, they've already received the benefits and the incentive of, what they can get out of it.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to contend with, it's like, it's because, it's like, I even experience it with the rattlesnake mitigation stuff where, a lot of the other people that do rattlesnake mitigation around me, they're going all in on the like Crocodile Dundee presentation of it, and like when they show up in their crocodile boots and their big hat and their khaki shirt, and they're like, where is it? Like, and they're gonna put on a show basically.
Yeah.
And, when I show up for a call, it's like the opposite of that. I'm like very calm and collected. And I'm like, I'm like, okay, show me where the snake is. And then I stand there looking at the snake with the homeowner, and I describe exactly what I'm about to do in detail and what they can expect the snake might do in response to that. And 9 times out of the 10, it's like I hook the snake, I get it into the bucket. The snake never rattles. It's like very relaxed the whole time. And they're kind of like, that's it.
Good.
And I'm like, yep, that's it. That's all. And they're like, oh, okay, that wasn't what I was expecting, and like, for me, that's a good thing. If they're a little bit bored by the presentation that I just offered, then like, whatever, like, that's not what you're actually paying me for. I'm not putting on a show here. And I want to, like, again, try to show that like this animal it's not going to like rear to life and try and like bite me in the neck, as I'm going to put it in the bucket, it's like I can make it do that shit if I want to, if I really mess with it. But like, again, that's not serving the snake. It's not serving me or the homeowner to do that. So,
well, yeah, the homeowner, you're then reinforcing
exactly.
that these are extraordinarily dangerous animals, and that, it's you want no part of them being around and all that. And what is your, how do you sell rattlesnakes to people? Like, if you come up to a homeowner that says, yeah, I've killed 7 of them,
Mm-hmm.
This one is, it's in a bad spot and I can't get to it with the shovel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you try to tell them that, hey, that it's beneficial for this animal to be alive over dead?
Yeah. It's tricky, and like it's definitely a case by case kind of thing. And sometimes I feel like I have to kind of choose my battles, because sometimes I'm like, I can tell like I'm never going to get through to this person, just the way that they're talking about it, and so it can really depend. Sometimes it's just like I'm just really candid, and I'm just like, I really love these animals, and like, obviously I do this because I love these animals. And sometimes that can open a door, because like the people are like, oh, like, what's wrong with you? Or like, why do you love these things? It's like, that's a weird thing to say. And then I can be like, oh, well, these are all the reasons, like why I think they're so interesting. And like, but sometimes it's also helpful to talk about like the ecological role and niche that they perform. That some people are receptive to that. There's a lot of people that don't give a shit about that. But there are also a lot of people that are like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. And like, oh yeah, they play a role in rodent mitigation, and they play a role in like seed dispersal, and like all these things that you wouldn't really think that they actually help with, but that are actually of benefit to them. And, like I definitely tell people, that, it's like a rattlesnake is a really great thing to have around in terms of like rodent mitigation and stuff like that. And you're way more likely to be irritated and annoyed and impacted by having a rodent infestation at your home than you are by having a rattlesnake out somewhere in your yard that you're probably never going to see most of the time, or that maybe you'll see once or twice a year, and then it goes on about its way and you go on about yours. And so, sometimes I can make those kinds of arguments as well, and then other times, I also like some people they're already kind of bought in, to that. They're already like, okay, this thing has a role. I might be scared of it. And with those people, I try to go a little bit further sometimes. And I'm like, okay, these are the reasons why you don't necessarily have to be totally afraid of this thing. You can have respect for it, but feel a bit more empowered, and not have to be fearful. And I can spend a little bit more time, showing them the snake, what's interesting about the snake, if its behaviors, its adaptations, that kind of thing. And also talk about like I was saying earlier, the kind of benefits of living alongside animals that have that kind of power is that it can have this, it can be a teacher for you on some level of like having more awareness of your environment and of yourself. And sometimes people are open to hearing that kind of stuff. It's like, again, it's not everybody that I'm going to try and talk to about that, but there are people that I've had really powerful conversations with people about that, and I've had conversations where a person started crying because they were like, wow, I've just never thought about these animals this way. And it's actually touching on a deep rooted fear that I have. And you're helping me to overcome that right now. And that's it's really cool to have that kind of interaction with somebody. It's almost therapeutic, because a lot of times it's people had one bad encounter with a snake where their little brother chased them with a snake or something like that when they were a little kid, and now they've been afraid of them their whole life. And now they're like, oh, this is actually totally disrupting my story, that I've been carrying my whole life about this thing. And that can be really profound for people sometimes. So yeah, like I said, it's different every time. And a lot of it, I think at this point is just I just trust myself to be myself around people with stuff like that. And to be able to discern what is going to land in the moment. Yeah. And thankfully, I think one of my gifts in terms of communicating with people about stuff like that is that my passion for the animals is really authentic. I don't have to perform about that. And so if I can convey my own feelings in a really authentic, genuine, sincere way, that can usually kind of bypass people's defenses. I think people can be pretty disarmed by just having a really genuine interaction, and an authentic experience with other people. And again, living in the day and age that we do, it's hard to find that a lot of the time, because especially in the world where everyone's trying to sell you something, and everyone's got their pitch, and so a lot of the kind of, like I said, it's a different way of doing things, and it's probably not as lucrative as the Crocodile Dundee approach and everything in the long run, but I think that it's more effective, because at the end of the day, I know that I've been able to help people actually change their perspective on snakes and living alongside them, because they've told me, and I've witnessed it. And that's worth way more to me than knowing that every time this person sees a snake in their yard, they're going to call me to come move it. I don't actually want to do that. They're that would probably be more lucrative, but it's actually not the best thing for the snakes or for me. And so it's not really what I want to do.
So when you do go out, it's more addressing the things that are drawing in the rattlesnakes. And then what do you do with the snakes that they potentially have called you out for?
Yeah. So, I will often move snakes. That's usually what starts the conversation, is that.
Yeah.
But then I use that as an opportunity to try and get a little bit deeper, if it's possible, with the homeowner or whatever. And so in those cases, when I will move snakes, and I always do short distance translocation. I never drive the snakes out 20 miles and dump them somewhere. Like I know other relocators around me do that exact thing. They just go, they have like one spot where they just go to dump the snakes. And I'm just like, why bother at that point? Like 99% of those snakes are just going to die.
Yeah.
And, statistically at least. And, that's no better than just, killing them. So, I will do like I said, the short distance thing as needed, but honestly, there's been a shift over time. Like that initially that was like the only thing I did. That was the only thing people wanted, but over time, as I've gotten better awareness of rattlesnakes and their habits and everything, I feel more confident in offering like consultations and stuff like that. And I advocate for that more. And I have like a really basic website where I offer that kind of service. And more people actually contact me about it. And that's great because that's, like I said, that's what I prefer to do. And another thing I've done in the past too is I've done like classes. Like I'm actually right now I'm preparing a lecture that I'm going to be offering for a local branch of like the Audubon Society. But it's also something that I'm hoping like I can also like offer to like HOAs and stuff like that, where there are people that live in rattlesnake country, where I can offer like a digital presentation basically that kind of talks about rattlesnakes, like their natural history, their ecology, but also gets into like, and this is how we can better live alongside them and have better understanding of, based on that biology, based on that natural history, what we can then do to live alongside them with more awareness and more effectiveness. And so that's something I want to be doing more and more. The more that I can kind of lean away from the translocation stuff, the better. But I know that that's always going to be needed on some level. And I do still think it's better. It's a better alternative to move a snake, a quarter or half mile away than it is for them to just, be certainly killed.
Yeah. How are you in any like local Facebook groups or anything like that where you're kind of bombarded by people and their misrepresentation of native wildlife and all that? Because I know that's something I really struggle with, and it's like insurmountable. You have to, like, I just have to leave most of the groups because it's so many uneducated people, and especially me being in Florida, being a Florida native, understanding that there's very little to no risk if you're doing the right things, and stuff like that. But a lot of the people here are transplants, and they're coming from somewhere that doesn't have any venomous snakes. Even bobcats, they'll take a picture and put it up and be like, keep your dogs inside, keep your young kids inside. And it's like, are you,
that's
like,
everywhere. Yeah.
You know how terrified these cats are? And they're like maybe 10, 15 pounds heavier than a regular cat.
Yeah. I know, man. Yes. The answer is yes. I see that every day, all day long. All the local, I'm in like a bunch of different community groups around the area that I live in. And like, maybe like once a year I'll post in those groups and say like, hey, I'm a rattlesnake guy. This is what I do, just so it's out there. And I probably should do it more often than that. But honestly, like part of the reason why I don't do it is that like, I only have so many hours in the day to argue with idiots, and it's hard. It's hard because like it's pretty much daily. Yeah. I see stuff like that. Whether it's rattlesnakes or it's black bears or it's bobcats or it's mountain lions or it's coyotes, it's people there's so much fear and misinformation out there that is just rampant, and I can't keep up with it, if I could get paid full time to do that, sit there all day and argue with people about why they're wrong about all that stuff, I would be happy to do it, but I don't get paid to do it. And I don't have time for it. And so it's like, It's hard. I do occasionally get sucked into stuff like that. Sometimes people will tag me, someone will post something about a rattlesnake and they'll tag me, and someone else I know, and then I'll respond and I'll say like, oh, you actually didn't have to kill that snake. And it's like, yeah, it's cool that that snake had 18 segments on its rattle or whatever, but what you didn't realize is that snake was probably 20 years old or something, and like, that's really fucking sad that like, that's how its life came to an end. And stuff like that. I'll try to offer as like diplomatic a response as I can. And I'm pretty good at staying diplomatic with stuff like that up to a certain point, but there's always like, there are some people that are just not reachable, especially online, who are just going to be like, like, oh, it's no, man, like what you're doing is a scam. And like these things, the only good snake is a dead snake. And this thing, the only use these things have is for a hat band or, a pot of stew, and I definitely see plenty of that. And I just don't, at a certain point, I can't indulge it. I just have to move on. And, but thankfully there are a lot of people that have at least a little bit of curiosity out there left in them, like if you can find those people that have a little bit of lingering curiosity left in their bodies, you can use that. You can leverage that to open doors and make people ask better questions and think about things a little bit more deeply, because it is just like I said, it's cultural change at the end of the day, and the mainstream cultural stance on rattlesnakes and other, predators, other dangerous wildlife is pretty extreme, and it sucks. It's like, where I live, in California, this is something I've talked about with people, and, there were 10,000 grizzly bears in California at one point, and now there are none.
Wow. Yeah.
And, it took only 70 years for the first, European settlers in California to wipe out 10,000 grizzlies. That's nuts. Like in terms of like the impact of 10,000 grizzlies on a land base, it's hard to even quantify that, because these are not subtle animals, like you're talking about 600 to 800 pound predators that do a lot of earth moving, that they have a big impact on the land base. And it's really, we're only 150 years at this point removed from that. And the land itself is still in a process of metabolizing that change. You know what I mean? And these are all recent things in the scale of like ecologies and ecological communities and all that stuff that we're still integrating. And that same thing is true for everywhere. It's like there were 50,000 grizzlies in the lower 48. They were in every state west of the Mississippi.
Wow.
Every state, they were all the way down into Mexico, in the desert, down in the Sonoran. They were all down there.
It's crazy.
Now we've got roughly 2,500 grizzlies, and they're in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and maybe a little portion of Eastern Washington. And that's it. That's all we got, and that's a crazy thing. But that was all driven by fear, and the reality that it does require a different kind of awareness to live alongside animals like that. It's like I've spent time backpacking in Glacier National Park and stuff like that. And like, it changes the way you move through the landscape, knowing that there are bears that can kill you out there. And I'm not saying that as like it's a bad thing to experience that. Like, I enjoyed that, when I was out there experiencing that, I was like, this is maybe how it's supposed to be on some level, and again, it's, you're not going to get that perspective out of everybody, but I think over time we can get closer to it by just cultivating a little bit more understanding, of course, and a little bit more reverence for these things.
Yeah, I think Dan Flores has a book that talks about all the animals that we've pushed to
Yeah.
extinction, and
Yep.
oh my God, it's heartbreaking. And
Yeah, dude.
just eye-opening too. I remember listening to that book and just working through it and just getting like really depressed. I mean, just
Yeah.
the plants that aren't native that are all across the country. The fact that we had a North American parrot that is now,
Mhm.
wiped out of existence is no longer here. Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking.
It
Um,
is. Yeah, it
and
is.
like they talk about the rewilding and the
Mhm.
bringing wolves back and things like that. They're never going to do that with grizzly bears. They're never going to do that.
There are people talking about it here in California. They're trying to like have the conversation. I think that they've been trying to have that conversation for like 10 years now, but yeah,
They can't even bring it up.
it's like good luck getting it to the point, where you can get a majority of the 40 million people that live in this state to be like, I want that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like it's going to be a long haul, and I hope that someday there are grizzlies back in California in certain remote parts of the state where they could be and they could still live here. There are still places where they could actually be, where there's enough space and there's enough, and the population is small enough that they could live. But it's a freaking uphill battle, man, for sure. And then like people are already freaking the hell out that wolves are starting to make their way back, and
Yeah.
they're like, a couple dozen, in the state right now. But the kind of, again, the fear that people have about them is so extreme, and actually I even experienced that because my dog is a wolf dog. She's part wolf and she looks like a wolf. She's small. She's 60 pounds, but like everywhere we go, people are like, is that a wolf? It's not subtle. And there are a lot of people that are terrified of her. Like they're like,
Yeah.
oh man, your dog, like your dog's eyes are scary because she looks different, and she has a different kind of presence too, and a different kind of intelligence than what people are used to in like a domestic dog. And thankfully she's a total sweetheart and everything, and she's very shy, but it's
And
interesting.
wolves are generally very shy animals. I mean, they're
Totally.
not. They don't. It's
They're,
not like they're chasing people down and they want to
no,
eat people. It's usually the biggest complaint is the livestock, right? They go after livestock.
exactly. That's the big thing. I think that there's actually like few, if any, confirmed wolf fatalities in like American history. Like it's
Wow.
extremely rare. And but they absolutely will opportunistically take livestock, and that's where the rift comes in. Although there's all kinds of research and studies that people are doing now. They're proving that like you can actually do pretty minimal things to mitigate the impact of that pretty effectively, apparently. And so I know that there's all kinds of people that are, in the rewilding community that are really advocating for, they're working for that PR message about wolves in California, and working with ranchers, who are really concerned and have genuine concerns. Of course, like I don't want to diminish their concerns in any way, but again, a lot of that stuff is out of proportion. It's blown out of proportion, and a little education and confronting the misinformation can go a long way in helping that kind of stuff. And it's crazy though, the scale of loss, that has happened, in North America and other parts of the world too. But when you actually learn about it, like most people just have no idea, they just don't know. And California is like a perfect example because, everyone thinks of California as like this big wild state that has a lot of public land, and it does. And it's also like, it is so drastically different from what it was 150 years ago. Like even just, the hydrology, like the way the rivers run in California, everything has changed because of the way that we've, managed the land here. And some of the work that I do outside of herpetoculture and all that stuff is I also do like, ecological stewardship work, and like I'll lead groups on like stewardship outings and stuff like that. And you know, it's hard because there's no simple answers to any of the questions. You know, people are confronting the issues that we have in California with wildfire and stuff like that. And like, that's a huge issue that is like, we're in a reckoning essentially that has been 150 years in the making with wildfire in California, where, you know, we've been suppressing fire for a long time, whereas California's indigenous people have practiced routine fire on the land for literally millennia, like 12,000 years. And part of the reason why that was done was to reduce fuel load, so that when fires did happen, they didn't become out of control. And when you stop doing that, like that was stopped, you know, with the arrival of the first settlers and the displacement and genocide of the indigenous population. You know, those fires weren't happening anymore. And there's also an incentive to prevent fire because we have the National Forest Service, right? That's part of the Department of Agriculture. It views the forest as a crop. What they want is dense stands of conifers that are competing for light because they grow vertically and have fewer lateral branches, fewer knots. It's a better lumber product, right? Well, that's not what you want for a healthy forest. And it's definitely not what you want for wildfire mitigation.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of in this moment where we've had 150 years in a lot of areas of biomass accumulation of fuel load. And so when these fires are starting now, they're ready to go, and they create their own weather. And so again, it's like, you know, I'm talking to a group about all this stuff, and they're like, well, what do we do? It's like, well, we gotta change a lot of things.
Yeah.
You know, it's that there are no easy answers. So it's all complicated. And personally, I have a lot more tolerance of that kind of complexity now than I used to. When I was younger, I used to feel really depressed about all this stuff and just like, what the hell are we going to do? And at this point, I think I feel a bit more patience about it, and just kind of like have this orientation to just keep swinging the axe, you know, and trying to play my part. But I don't know, this is obviously a big tangent away from herpetoculture, but I think where it ties in, you know, it's just that the same is true in herpetoculture, right? We've got these cultural issues, you know, on some level with like things like free handling, and they're incentivized by certain ways in which the structure is in place, right? And it's up to us as a community to kind of like push against that and try and be good ambassadors to take it in a different direction, right? And thankfully there are a lot of good people that are doing that, you know, and I try to just like, you know, uplift and amplify the people who are doing things differently and they're doing it right. And thankfully there's a lot of that. So it's not hard to find good things to encourage.
Yeah. Just so real quick, are controlled burns something that the state is looking at bringing back to sort of mitigate the wildfires? Is that like something that's, because we do those constantly here in Florida. They're always constantly doing controlled burns.
Right, because you guys have like these long leaf savanna habitats, right, that are totally fire adapted, and they need that. And it's good for them. And it's a similar thing here too. We have a lot of fire adapted ecosystems, and there is a more and more acceptance of using what we call it good fire, using good fire on the land. And there's actually some cool like indigenous led organizations and groups that are doing that. There's one local to me where it's, you know, it's California native people leading it, but who are doing, you know, modern stewardship practices and all that stuff. And that's really cool to see, because they're basically, you know, doing their ancestral work and being able to make a living in modern society with that. And that's awesome to see. But but it's an uphill battle, and there's a lot. It's also not as simple as just like, we can't just like start burning again, because again, we have all this fuel load accumulation. So you got to like figure out a way to reduce the fuel load gradually, before we can then reintroduce like routine burning. And
they're going in, they're harvesting lumber from these national forests, and that's why they don't want to do the routine burns.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. In some cases, I mean, historically speaking, that's slowly starting to change. But like, yeah, like it's interesting. Like when I was a kid growing up, when I heard the term national forest, I thought that like the implication of that to me was like protected forest land, right? Like part of like a national park, but it's totally a different part of the administration, and it's actually under the Department of Agriculture, and so it's actually forest land that is then leased to logging companies to log, and it's a totally different thing. And a lot of times, like that's not really done in a way that is necessarily the best for the ecology or for fire resilience, because a lot of times these places are clear cut, so they're just basically just cutting every tree in a stand, right? And then it's just like totally denuding the landscape. You're going to have issues, all kinds of issues with that, but also like you're going to have issues with fire as things come back, because they're growing in a different kind of density. And so there's slow change to like more kind of fire aware and like biodiversity, supporting methods of harvest and all of that stuff. But it's a super complicated process. And there's also like, thinning that is done now to do on some level, like, to reduce fuel load, to reduce biomass. So like one issue that we really have in this part of California is what we call conifer encroachment, which is basically like it's Douglas fir trees primarily, which are a super successful, resilient tree. They can grow in almost any conditions. Those are coming in underneath the canopy of what have historically been hardwood forests, like oak woodlands or oak savannas. And they're encroaching into those habitats. And over time, what'll happen if there's no intervention is those conifers they'll pierce the canopy of the hardwoods, and then they'll shade out the hardwoods and kill them. And what happens when that occurs is you lose a huge percentage of your biodiversity, because those hardwoods are supporting way more species than the conifers are. Like it's not even close. Like it's an order of magnitude in difference. And also, of course, you don't want a bunch of dead standing hardwoods in terms of fuel load. That's a really bad thing. And so, like I said, when I was, speaking about the first people, like California's indigenous people, they were aware of this cycle of succession, which is a natural cycle, right? And their food system was based on those hardwoods, based on acorns, but also based on the biodiversity that was supported by these habitats, because those are the most biodiverse habitats in this region, are the hardwood forests. And so what they did to prevent that succession process from changing over to the conifers was burning, because the hardwoods are all fire resilient, but juvenile conifers are not. So by doing routine burns, they would burn out the understory, burn all the conifers that would be encroaching in, and prevent that from, changing over into a conifer forest.
Wow.
And so it's like, it's also, you have to praise the brilliance of the people who were managing this land for so long, because they were really aware of these cycles and systems and how it impacted them, but also how it impacted like other creatures, which is really incredible. And so, there's some, fur thinning is something that I'll do a lot, honestly, when I'm leading stewardship groups and stuff like that. One thing that we'll often do is we'll go into these areas where, young fir trees are encroaching underneath oaks, and we'll cut them. And it's not the same thing as fire, right? Because fire is like fully eliminating those trees and turning them to ash, which is Also really beneficial for hardwoods. They really like the alkalinity in the soil that gets added to by ash and all of that stuff. But it does help prevent that turnover to conifer forests and gives the hardwoods more of a chance to continue to live and do their thing, which is really important, again, for so many species here.
Damn. Well, thanks, dude, for coming on. I really appreciate it, and it sounds like you're doing a giant service for your local community there, and you're very well educated on your surroundings, and it seems like you're helping people out a lot.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff that I'm passionate about. You know, I feel like the land has given me a lot in my life. You know, I had a pretty hard upbringing, early life, and where I felt like the most at home and the most like solace was like getting outside, and so over time, you know, following from that, I've had more and more interest in it and want to learn more and more about it, and so now a lot of my life is structured around doing what I can to support the wild places around me and the wild creatures, and thankfully herpetoculture gets to be part of all that too, which is really cool. I appreciate you making time for me to come on today. It's been really fun.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Thanks, man. I appreciate you putting up with all the technical difficulties.
Oh, dude, I am the king of technical difficulties. So that was nothing. You have no idea.
All right, man. Thanks. We'll have to do it again.
Time.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I enjoy it.